Uh, Welcome to today's tender writing workshop. Today's session is really going to provide some general tender writing skills for any applications that you might be responding to. And we're going to be using Skilling Queenslanders for Work as our context. Now we're lucky enough to have some DESBT colleagues on the line today. So any questions that we do have about the Skilling Queenslanders for Work the initiative and our responses to it, we'll have them there to answer our questions. Now, before I get into the content of the tender writing workshop itself, I would like to acknowledge the Yagara people. It is on their land that I'm on today, delivering this workshop in the south side of Brisbane, right on the fringes of the Yugambeh speaking nation. So I extend my acknowledgement to them as well. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Darumbal people of Central Queensland. It was on their land that I was born and raised. I was very lucky to grow up in a lovely spot where the ocean wasn't too far away, but I had the bush as well. And so I think about the Darumbal people often when I think about those childhood memories of the lovely place I grew up. I extend this acknowledgement to any First Nations people on the line today or listening to this webinar. And I encourage you when you're introducing yourself in the chat to name the country that you're on today as well. So we'll do that. Please share your name, your organisation, which country you're on. And it's really useful to know also how many of you have submitted a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application before. We can glean a lot from the experiences of those who have previously written applications for this initiative. It's been a fairly long-standing initiative, Skilling Queenslanders for Work, and people have learned a lot along the way. So really happy to hear from those who have submitted before. The purpose of the workshop today is really around preparing adequately for a grant application. And as I've mentioned, these tips, these skills, and the methodology I'm going to share can be applied broadly across your writing, and I'm sure you'll be able to use it for many tender applications. We're going to talk about writing clearly and succinctly, and some really more technical writing skills. And we're going to speak generally about avoiding common mistakes in tender writing and specifically Skilling Queenslanders for Work applications too. In the workshop, I'm going to provide a background to Skilling Queenslanders for Work. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail around the initiative itself because there is a webinar on our website entitled Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And that's a great one to watch if you're looking for some specific details about each of the programs, about eligibility requirements and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to provide a broad overview today. Then we're going to move into a methodology for applying for funding, turning an idea into a funding application. We're going to look at crafting responses to the assessment criteria, and we'll use the Skilling Queenslanders for Work as a specific example for that. And at the end of the workshop, we're going to briefly look at understanding your obligations regarding the Human Rights Act and child safe principles. So there's a bit to get through. Now, for anyone who is listening to this webinar, because we are recording it, any questions that are popped into the chat, I will do my best to voice them so that you don't miss out on those. And for those participating live, really encourage you to put questions into the chat if you have them. And we do have a small group today, so very happy for you to take yourself off mute and voice your questions that way, or any comments that you might have to add. Okay, so what is Skilling Queenslanders for Work? I'm sure you've heard of it because it's one of the Queensland Government's flagship initiatives, which has been really successful. We've seen an annual investment of $80 million to support 15,000 Queenslanders into work each year. It represents a commitment to increasing workforce participation, driving job growth and strengthening the performance of the Queensland economy. Skilling Queenslanders for Work has been around for a while, but the workforce landscape is looking a little different. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the importance of support for those in the community who are most vulnerable to reduced employment opportunities. So Skilling Queenslanders for Work supports the delivery of tailored, local community-based support to young people mature age job seekers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people with disability, women re-entering the workforce, the Australian Defence Force veterans, recently released prisoners, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So a really broad range of different target cohorts for this program. Skilling Queenslanders for Work is characterised by clearly defined target groups, voluntary participation, individual pathways, an integrated mix of assistance and strong support for participants. The initiative is supported by a statewide regional network working closely and forming partnerships with community-based organisations and local employers to determine local skills and entry-level industry and labour needs. The program relies heavily on partnerships formed within communities to ensure participants have a pathway to employment. And we're going to talk about partnerships several times throughout this workshop, and you'll come to see that they really are the cornerstone of Skilling Queenslanders for Work. Now, there are 8 programs that make up the Skilling Queenslanders for Work initiative. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about each of those programs that are available, but there is plenty of information on the DESBET website. And again, you can listen to the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders webinar if you're interested in finding out some more detail about those. Okay, so for any of you who have submitted a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application before, are there any key learnings that you would like to share about that? You're welcome to take yourself off mute or pop it into the chat. We had quite a large group yesterday, and some of the things that they were sharing were things like ensuring you have enough time to put together a good application, that many elements of your application actually take quite a bit of thought. And as I've mentioned already, partnerships are a critical aspect of Skilling Queenslanders for Work, and anything involving partnership always takes a little bit longer than what we think in the beginning. So it is one of those tenders that isn't able to be done rushed and done very quickly if you're wanting to do a good job of it, because it has other people involved. Making sure you meet the eligibility requirements is one of the other things that was shared. Making sure that you've got good letters of support. And if you don't know what letters of support are, we're going to talk about them a little bit more in the workshop too. So even if you have applied for Skilling Queenslanders for Work before and been successful, there are probably still things that you could do to improve your application. As an initiative grows, awareness of an initiative or attending tender availability grows in the community. Sometimes those rounds become a little bit more competitive. So there's always some things that you can do to improve the tender that you're putting together. So what is the department looking for in funding responses? Whenever you're submitting any funding application, it's really important to understand the objectives for the funder and what they're looking for. So if we use Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an example, what is the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training looking for in a funding response? To sum it up, they're looking for community-based organisations who approach projects with the intent to provide genuine support and assistance to participants. This means organisations who understand their target cohort and their barriers to employment, and who can provide the support to help them develop the skills they need to gain employment in their local regions. And for some of you, this will require careful consideration of how the landscape and support needs have changed since COVID. For any tender application you write, you need to be really clear on the intent of the funding and ensure your idea fits the brief. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, applications must demonstrate that the community-based organisations understand the intent of Skilling Queenslanders for Work, which are to develop the skills of disadvantaged Queenslanders, that is people who are underutilised or underemployed in the labour market, as well as building the skills of people in the target groups, providing assistance to individuals who need support to enter and stay in the workforce. Training and assessment strategies must support the needs of disadvantaged learners, and the community-based organisations have legitimate and established employer engagement strategies in place. One clear point that the department has made is that training for training's sake is not acceptable. So the project really needs to be driven by the community-based organisation and is based on their understanding of their clients and not driven by the RTO. So in any tender or funding opportunity that you're responding to, you're really thinking about what success looks like in the context of that funding and ensuring that that's something that realistically your organisation can deliver on. And for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, success really is two-pronged. It is about gaining skills or qualifications and moving participants through some kind of training program or skill development, but the other success outcome is employment and long-term employment. So it really is about meeting both of those success measures. It's therefore essential that in your application you provide evidence that you understand your cohort or clients in your community, you understand their barriers and what resources they might need to overcome them, that you can provide assistance they need to gain employment, that you know where and how you can recruit participants, that you have links to employers who can provide jobs in your local community. So providing this evidence is really crucial for any grant or funding application. And as we'll go through the presentation today, I'll give you some tips on how you can do this. So how can you ensure you meet the requirements of funders, serve your participants and your community, and fund your work? And I think the answer to that is using a methodical approach to winning tenders. So I'm going to take you through an 8-step process of preparing, planning, and writing a solid application. These steps you can apply to any funding or tender process, but as you'll see, I'll be using Skilling Queenslanders for Work as my example through this. So here's the methodology for writing tenders. And my recommendation is that you start mapping out your tender plan well before you start writing your response. And you might think that that's a lot of work or you don't have time to work through all of those steps. But by applying a methodical approach, you're really much more likely to be able to build a strong case and put forward a really good proposal and a balanced proposal. By the time you get to step 6, which is crafting your response and actually writing things down, you really should have a very clear idea about what you want to include in your proposal, and the writing part will be much easier. We're going to start here. The first part of the process is to create a grants reference library, to map out your project idea and foster strong working relationships. And we'll go through each of these steps in more detail now. So for those who've written a grant application before, have you ever found yourself scrambling for information like your financial statements or insurance details 5 minutes before the tender is due to close? I've definitely had similar experiences to that. And that's why we recommend the first step in your grants toolkit is to start putting together a grants reference library. So that's one place where you keep all of the information you might need for funding applications. That way you have one point of truth. And for example, if your accountant's on holidays or someone in the team gets COVID, you know where the financial statements are held or where the insurance policy is or where the approved blurb about your organisation that you use for funding applications is kept. So all of those things that you would be generally using for funding applications are all in one good spot. The other idea you might like to take on board is keeping a library of funding ideas in your grants reference library. So it might be a list or some fleshing out some ideas of projects or things that you would love to do if funding came up that was suited into the future. And that way, when some funding that is suitable comes up, you've already got some of those ideas fleshed out and ready to go. So here's a list of some of the things you might include in a grants reference library. Audited financial statements, you will need those for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. Insurance details, your ABN, bank details, not-for-profit status perhaps, a description of your organisation. Lots of tenders these days do require resumes of key staff that will be working on the project. So that's something that you can keep in there too. Another idea is to keep copies of past grant applications along with any feedback that you got for them, regardless of whether or not they were successful. And by keeping them in there, I'm absolutely not recommending that you're copying, pasting words from previous grant applications, because that will come with a few challenges in itself when we're copying and pasting information. But if you've done good writing, or thinking about particular things, it can be really useful to refer to it and see what your thinking or your responses have previously been, because it can save you quite a bit of time if you're able to refer to those. Okay, so step 2 is mapping out your project idea. We've put together a grant on a page resource with some prompters on it on how to map out your project idea. Michael shared it in the chat. And as we're talking, if you're in an office where you can print it off, you might like to jot things down as we go, or you might like to look at it later. You can see that it's double-sided, so I'll refer to the back page in a little bit here. But this resource is really designed to help you describe, analyze, and design your project model, so that when it comes to writing your application and answering the assessment criteria, you have a really clear idea about what your project actually is and what it looks like. And it's any project that does involve other people, which Skilling Queenslanders for Work does, this kind of activity, brainstorming or mapping something out on a piece of paper right at the beginning, is a great way to ensure that all partners are on the same page as far as what the project actually looks like, because often we do make assumptions about what others mean by particular things, or just make assumptions about how something might look based on what we in our organisation usually do. So it's a great way to really cover off on the important details of your project and ensure everyone is on the same page. And this is what it looks like if you haven't already opened it. It's also available on the QCOS website, and we'll be sending it out in a post-event email. Now, does your project fit with your strategic plan and your organisation's mission? It's really important to consider whether or not funding really fits for your organisation. If it's not a good fit, you might not be the best organisation to deliver the project. And that's a tricky question to answer sometimes. And sometimes we don't like the answer, but it's crucial that we make sure we're not taking on funding and projects that don't really fit with our core business or our mission. A tip from one of the department's Skilling Queenslanders for Work assessors is to think about who you work with on a daily basis and develop projects to support your own clients. You know your core business well, and you do a good job of it. So leverage from what you already know and the organisational expertise that you already hold. To sum all of that up, if you were applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, if someone reading your application can answer these questions, then you're on the right track. And these are the kinds of questions that you will have discussed and brought up if you're completing that kind of brainstorming or grant on a page template. These are all the kinds of things that you need to be including in a project summary. Okay, and step 3 in this first part of the methodology before we move on to anything else is building strong working relationships. Now, I've mentioned that anything to do with partnership does take time. So the time to form partnerships is absolutely not right when you need a letter of support to finish your funding application. If funding opportunities come up, you need to be ready to go. So start early and be proactive in building relationships. Now, the good news is that, look, the community-based organisations I know and the sector that I'm familiar with are good at this work already. You have strong working relationships with other sector partners because you need to. You are sometimes referring clients to other organisations. You know what other services are out there in your community. So this is the time to be really working on those relationships and getting them ready for a partnership style working. And it's a good idea to talk to your funder and start building a relationship with them. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, talk to the regional representatives from DESBET before you start your application. They strongly encourage you to contact them to discuss your project idea before you get writing on it, because they can give you some great guidance. They can let you know if that kind of thing's been done before and perhaps what the challenges are, or maybe who you need to speak to about it. They are an invaluable resource when it comes to putting together a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application. So really recommend you get onto your regional office sooner rather than later to discuss your idea with them. Now, if you're working with a registered training organisation or RTO, you need to talk to them well before you're submitting an application, because you need to establish in your application how you selected them. And what your relationship really looks like. And again, I want to reiterate that this process is really led by the community-based organisation, not by an RTO approaching a community-based organisation. So the next part of the process is to match your project to a grant or a program, then create a team to work on the application, including any key partners. Now, if you're participating in this workshop or listening to this workshop, it's likely that you have already identified Skilling Queenslanders for Work as your funding opportunity, which is great. However, here is some additional sources for finding grants. It's also worth talking to your partners and other organisations that you work with so they can give you first-hand experience. Now, Skilling Queenslanders for Work is the kind of funding opportunity where it's great to leverage from other opportunities and add value to it. So think about what other projects you're delivering in your community, what projects others are delivering in your community, and see whether or not you might be able to dovetail your activities a little bit to add value to whatever it is that you're already doing. Now, as tempting as it can be, when you see an opportunity come up for funding and your organisation needs funding, I really don't recommend wasting time applying for grants if your project ideas or your organisation doesn't fit the criteria. Make sure you find grants that match your ideas, not squeeze your ideas into grants. And this is where your ideas library might come in handy too. Now, if you're applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, remember that there are 8 programs to be choosing from. Talk to the regional representative in the department about your project, and they can give you some direction on which program is most appropriate for you. If you have found funding that you think matches well with your organisation's direction, it's time to decide if you want to meet the requirements of the funder. So the first step is to assess the requirements that are in the documents provided. So there's generally some kind of guide to the application, some supplementary documents available on the department website or the funder's website. Going through all of those can be a little overwhelming at first when you're trying to get your head around what this funding really is and what you might be able to do with it, but it's well worth the effort and the time right at the beginning to ensure that you do meet the requirements of the funder. And once you've assessed that, it's time to make a go or no-go decision. This is where you need to make a strategic decision about whether or not to go ahead with the application. Are you eligible? Does it align with your strategic goals and values or not? And sometimes it won't. And that can be frustrating and can be hard to walk away from a funding opportunity. But it's not worth putting together a proposal that doesn't really meet the requirements of the funder. And they'll be able to tell if your organisation doesn't really fit. Now, sometimes, on the other hand, you will find that the outcomes of your project idea or what you would like to do is only slightly different from the outcomes being sought by the funder. And in those cases, you might want to go ahead, but make sure you make the link between the objectives in your submission and the funder's objectives so that you show you do understand their requirements and that the project can deliver on them. So it's really up to you as an organisation to decide whether or not tweaking your project ideas to fit funding is something that you want to do. And again, it's always a good idea, if the opportunity is available, to run ideas past the funder. Now, finally, this is an important question. Do you have time to apply for this funding round? It might be better to leave it for a future funding round so that you have enough time to put together a really good application. And the good thing about Skilling Queenslanders for Work is we know that this is a long-standing funding initiative and there will be another round. So if you don't think that your application is going to be really fantastic and ready to be submitted by 5 p.m. on the 31st of March 2022, you might want to get started on your application now, but leave it till the next funding round if that's an option for your organisation. Now, if you call your regional DESBT office, you'll be able to speak to the team there or one of their colleagues, and one of them's on the line today to answer questions if you would like to approach them now. But their contact details are there and they're very friendly and happy to chat to you about your project idea. Okay, so we're making sure we're reading the funding guidelines before we start the application. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, the guidelines for each program contain information on the objectives of the program, the eligibility criteria, the expected outcomes and KPIs, which I think is a fantastic feature of those fact sheets, and how the applications will be assessed, plus the assessment criteria. Now, again, it can feel overwhelming to go through all of this information when you're pushed for time, but there's no shortcut to it. There's no shortcut to finding out and getting a really clear idea and full picture about what's required from you. All of these documents will help you build up your understanding so that you can apply, submit an application that shows that you fully understand their intentions behind this funding. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, applications are only accepted via the application portal. So make sure you're registered and familiar with what's in the portal well before the deadline. Don't leave it to the last minute and find that you don't have what's required for your submission. Other resources that are available on the SKU website are the user support guide and frequently asked questions. So make sure you have a look at those as well. Now, I'm going to share in some of the slides in a little bit some screenshots of what the portal looks like so you can get familiar with that if you haven't yet jumped on their website. Okay, so a key message here, and I'm sure you've already picked up on it, is to start early. In a Grants in Australia report, 54% of respondents said that they had started an application that they didn't end up submitting, which is a real shame. So 38% said it was because they ran out of time to complete the application form. And I can't give you more time, but I can help you save time by following this methodology that we're sharing today. The survey also found that 27% dropped out partway through filling out the application when they found out that their program really wasn't, the program that they were responding to really wasn't right for them. And 16% of respondents said they dropped out after discovering that they didn't fit the eligibility requirements. So it really does pay to do your research and planning well before you start writing your application to make sure that you can address the criteria. Now, the next step in this methodology is around creating a team and a timeline for your application. So who needs to have a role in the grant application? Now, for those from small organisations, you might be thinking, I don't really have a team. It's just me. I'm going to write the submission by myself. But it is very likely that there are other people involved, even if they're not writing. For example, does someone need to approve your application before you submit? Who are they? Are they available on the due date? Do you need to arrange a time with them? Are they usually in the office? Are they at home? Who has the financial statements? Where are they saved? Is that person taking leave that week? Do we need to get it beforehand? Who are the partners? Are they going to submit their letters of support in time? Will I need to chase them up? Do they need to be involved in this beginning process so they understand what's required in the letter of support? As you can see, particularly for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, which is really dependent, the success of it is dependent on those good partnerships and the wraparound support available to participants. You can see that there, even if you're the person writing the application, there are certainly other people involved in putting everything together. So what are the key roles and what are their responsibilities and who needs to be involved? Some of the roles you might think about assigning could include the writer, and that might be you, the proofreader. If you're doing quite a large program or it's spanning across multiple regions, you might have a partnership broker that's working on that side of things. An IT person, finance officer that might be working on the budget with you, the chair who might be approving tender applications before they're submitted. So even if someone's role in the submission seems quite small, like the IT person who helps you with problems uploading the documents, if you've got everyone on board early and include them officially in the team, you'll get a lot more ownership and buy-in to the project. And you avoid those complications of that person, you're assuming that person's going to be in the office that day to help you, but actually they've taken leave that week and you didn't realize, or little things like that are small things but actually cause quite big hiccups in the process if you're not aware. So making sure everyone knows what their role is, what they need to be doing, what date it needs to be done on, makes the process a lot smoother. It helps to set up a tender team and have a kickoff meeting if you can. You might use that grant on a page template to show everyone what's going on and get everyone on the same page. So Developing a timeline is the next step. So generally you're working backwards from your due date. In this case, for Skilling Queenslanders work, that's the 31st of March. So having that date there on the calendar, from there we can work backwards. We know approximately how much time each task is really going to take. We can assign roles, make sure that we've got adequate time to do all of the things that need to be done, and mark that time out in your diary or your calendar. Now, a really key part of the planning process, as I've mentioned, is to read through those guidelines for funding and assess the requirements. This is a screenshot of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work Guide to applying for funding, which is a fantastic, easy to read document that makes it really clear what the assessment criteria is asking you for, what evidence you need to be providing. Also talks about eligibility, funding, like the budget side of things. It's a fantastic document. So we're going to drop that into the chat. It's a really good idea to read through it, and it's not a difficult document to get through this one. And you might use a tender planning checklist to capture all the things that we've just talked about. So the requirements that you've gotten from those funding guidelines. If you look on the second page of the grant on a page resource, we've already filled that out with quite a few different things to include on your checklist. Now, how are you going to evaluate your project? It is a very important part of the planning process, so make sure it's not an afterthought. Often we do think about evaluation as something that's quite a bit in the distance, something we don't need to worry about right now. It's something we do at the end. But thinking about how you're going to measure success really actually helps you with the planning part of it. And as you're writing your application, think about whether or not you can deliver what you say you will and how you're going to measure it. Thinking about those measurements and those KPIs or outcomes at the end of our project really actually helps us with thinking about whether or not our ideas are realistic right at the beginning. And that can save a lot of pain down the track. It also pays to think about whether or not you need to build evaluation into your budget. And that might not be the case for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. I'm not saying that's absolutely what you need to be doing in this case, but in many funding scenarios, grant seekers, for example, in that Grants in Australia survey that I referenced earlier, 20% of the respondents in that survey wished that they had allocated funding in their budget to do evaluation. Even if it's not costing you a lot cash-wise, the human resources and hours required to do good evaluation is often more than what people assume. So, but it's such an important aspect of delivering a program because it's that evaluation and that data that sets you up for future funding. And it forms the evidence that you can use for future applications. It also lets us know whether or not we're doing a good job. Lets us know if the methodology we're using is worthwhile, and the mode of delivery we're using. It helps us figure out we need to tweak the things that we're doing, which is always a good thing for human services to be considering and thinking about. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. Now you've done all of that good planning, we get down to the actual process of writing the application. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of developing clarity around your project, and writing the grant on a page, filling out that template will really establish your thoughts and some structure for your responses. Now we're going to think about this all as a scaffolding for our writing, just like if we were building a building, when we're crafting written responses, we're going to show you some scaffolding for doing that. Now, the key message here is that you're not writing a novel. So I'm not talking about the length here or the fact that you can't be creative. I'm talking about the fact that the structure is fundamentally different. So creative writing tends to introduce details like characters and scenes, and the whole intent is to make us intrigued, leave a bit of mystery, find out what's going to happen. There's a climax, there's a twist. We're left wondering. That is not the case for any kind of tender writing. So a tender response demands the exact opposite. There's no room for intrigue and working up to a point. The reader wants to be hit with the key points straight up. So you need to start with your key message, then provide your supporting points and themes, then detail, data and evidence. And that's where that evidence side of things or evaluation data really comes into play. Now, by putting examples and evidence down at the bottom, I don't mean to say it's less important at all, simply that you need to start with your key message. When we're structuring our response, we want to decide what the key messages will be first. It's a good idea to do some brainstorming with colleagues for this purpose. Sometimes you see responses that build to the point and they might use lots of examples before drawing a conclusion, but you really need to be putting your key messages right up front. So if we use Skilling Queenslanders for Work as our example, if you're going to structure a response for the assessment criteria, servicing community and industry needs, you might highlight the key areas you need to address in this criteria. In this example, you need to demonstrate a few things and I've highlighted them here. These are the key aspects that we've pulled out of this assessment criteria. You need to be demonstrating that you understand the skills and labour needs of your local community and how your project will address them. You need to be providing evidence of local industry demand and benefit, local skill shortages and future employment opportunities. So there's great clues here as to what the assessment committee will be looking for. So make sure you talk about how your project will link with other local initiatives or services and give evidence of your links to local employers. And don't forget to attach your current letters of support because this is where you will need them. Now, your funder or the assessors not wanting to be mysterious about what it is that they're asking you for. So each of the assessment criteria are very clear and you don't need to be straying off the path and talking about other things that aren't strictly in that assessment criteria. So make sure your responses really stick to exactly what's being asked in the assessment criteria question. Now, here is a good example visually of the scaffolding for this response. So we look at that assessment criteria that we're going to respond to. It's how will the training address local industry skills and labour needs? Is there any impact on the wider community? And outline how the project is responsive to local community and regional needs and conditions. Okay, so we've pulled out the key things here. We've got local need, impact on community, linking the project to the need, and the local support that we've got for it. These are the 4 things that we've pulled out of that assessment criteria that we think we need to address. Now, this is just an example for illustration purposes only. You might be allocating different word limits for each of these things, but the point really is to show you how you can build a balanced response to the assessment criteria and ensure that you're not spending 3/4 of your word limit on talking about local need and only leaving yourself a small amount of characters or words to talk about all these other things. Okay, so you can see here, we've also got the key message that you want to say and you can put bullet points, you can put what you like here or keywords, what evidence you're going to be using for that key message. So mapping this out right at the beginning, it does a couple of things for us. It helps us make sure our responses are really balanced, that we're not spending too many words on one thing and not another. It makes us really clear about the key message that we're putting forward. And this helps give our response a lot of clarity. It's not confusing to the funder about what it is that we're trying to say. And it ensures that we have thought about the evidence that we have for the key messages. It makes us check ourselves. How do we know that that's true? Do we have something to actually back that up? Have I spoken to enough people in the community or other organisations or employers to know that that's actually accurate, or is it a story I've been telling myself? Sometimes we do need to check those things. So thinking about what evidence we're going to use for each of these key messages helps us not get caught out talking about particular things that we don't actually have any evidence for, which is really important. So here's a starting point. You can see here in this response, I'll read it out. There's some good information, but it doesn't explicitly address each point in the assessment criteria, and the key messages aren't really clear. And the big thing is there's no evidence. You might also pick up on some of the areas where you can simplify the language and cut words to help with the word count. I'll read it out and you can see if you can spot some of the refining that could be done to the writing. Okay, so it says, Superhot has been delivering accredited early childhood education training programs since 2009. This program involved partnership arrangements between childcare centres and registered training organisations. In 2012, we expanded our program to include cultural competency training for working with Aboriginal families, as there is a large population of Aboriginal families in the region. In 2017, we added a new training program specifically targeting migrant and refugee women, as there has been a very significant increase in migrant families in the local community. Trained staff are a requirement of the Early Childhood Education and Care national regulations, and there is currently a shortage of qualified staff in Utopia. Unemployment and underemployment is significantly higher for Aboriginal and migrant women in the region, so these programs are helping to deliver employment opportunities. There is also a growing number of families moving into the area, so demand for childcare is increasing. Okay, so you might have identified a few things in there, if you're thinking from the perspective of the assessor or the funder, that you could improve. And here is our edited version of this response. Now, you wouldn't be keeping those brackets there when you're submitting it, but I'm just showing you there that each of those key messages that we put down here are very clearly made in this response here. There's a short paragraph for each of those things that we needed to respond to. There's a key message and there's evidence for each thing. So this is a fictitious response, obviously, but it just shows you how you can map out how the mapping pans out when you're actually writing, and how it can really assist you to write a clear, balanced response to the assessment criteria. Now, I'm not saying to copy this word for word, but it really is just showing you an example of how that mapping process assists with the writing itself. So as you can see, the first key message about local need is that there's a growing demand and a shortage of qualified staff. You put in there where you got the information and provide evidence to back that up. So as you can see, there is some ABS data used in that third paragraph. There's actually some good evidence and showing that the organisation can tell the funder where they actually got these ideas and why they think this project is important, because they've actually done the thinking behind the need and the shortage and what can actually address that. How to best answer assessment criteria. So we're now going to use the Skilling Queenslanders for Work initiative to go through how to address the assessment or selection criteria. While this is specific to the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs, you will find that many funding applications have similar selection or assessment criteria that might just be worded differently, or the process is the same. Understand what the criteria is asking for and make sure you address it specifically. In any tender development process, responding to the assessment criteria will be the biggest part of your writing effort. Your answers will only be as good as the thinking that you've done during your preparation. And responding to the assessment criteria is your opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the requirements, that you have evidence, that you can demonstrate your capacity to deliver, and demonstrate value for money, and to articulate your unique value proposition. The assessment or selection criteria should reflect what is most important to the funder. And these criteria will be used to score and rank your proposal in relation to others. So you should be aware that sometimes different people may assess different parts of your application. So it's not always a good idea to answer criteria by referring to information in other criteria. It may be necessary to repeat information where it's important to addressing that specific criteria. So here are some of our tips for answering the assessment criteria. You need to be really clear about what's being asked for in each criteria and what needs to be included. And we'll go through the Skilling Queenslanders for Work criteria very soon and unpack those. A good response will be clear, concise, and comprehensive. Now, being comprehensive while being concise can be tricky, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. Plan your key messages and make sure they're up front. Remember, we've got a limited word count for this tender response. We can't be talking about wasting word count, talking about things that haven't specifically been asked for. And make sure you provide evidence to back up your claims. Okay, so for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, this is what the assessment criteria really looks like. Now, they're assessed in 2 stages. Stage 1 assessment includes the assessment against capacity to manage criteria. So an applicant must demonstrate a capacity to manage in order to be eligible to proceed to stage 2 of the assessment. This includes things like financial viability, your governance, and your experience with staff with appropriate experience. So we'll go into more detail to that criteria shortly, but I just wanted to make this really clear. Even if you've put an enormous amount of effort into the rest of your funding application, unfortunately, it won't be looked at if you haven't adequately demonstrated your capacity to manage the program. So it's just really important that you're putting the right amount of energy and effort into each of the criteria to make sure you can move through the entire assessment process. Now, stage 2, you'll see here, stage 2, these criteria here, that actually involves a local advisory jobs committee, which is comprised of representatives from the community, from your community, from industry, from government, and from unions. So the roles of these committees is to discuss, prioritise, and recommend applications for funding. So your Skilling Queenslanders for Work application won't just be assessed by a team in a head office somewhere. They will actually be looked at by a committee that is local to your region, who have knowledge of your region and have some expertise and some well-formed opinions about what's going to be working well in your community. So this is a screenshot from that guide to applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work funding. And we've previously referred to this and it was shared in the chat. So what's being asked here is about issues such as financial viability of the lead organisation, your structure, governance, risk, your reporting framework, what's your relationship with the RTO, and importantly, what relevant experience you have in this area. So what the department really wants to know is, can your organisation deliver what you say you're going to deliver? A very important question. Now, I mentioned the portal earlier. This is where you're going to be inputting your responses and your tender. This is what it will look like. You can see here that you're going to have to put in your words, your response that you formed for this first selection criteria. And you can see here, there's some mandatory documents that are required to complete your application. And this is where you might be pulling documents from that grants reference library that I referenced earlier. Really important to make sure you keep that, whatever location you're keeping these documents, that they're up to date so that you're not accidentally attaching old documents that have been used in previous applications or outdated things. You can see here that there's a maximum of 2,800 characters here. So again, you can't just keep talking and talking and talking. You need to be succinct in your response. And that's why mapping out how many words you might be using for each point that you're wanting to make is a really good idea. You don't get caught out waffling on too much about one thing and then not leaving yourself enough room for another. So 2,800 characters, that includes spaces and punctuation. So I estimate that that's about 3/4 to one full A4 page, or about 350 to 400 words. So the app will tell you when you run out of characters. And see, that's what this little 200 plus is in the corner here. It will let you know when you're running out of room. It's fine to use bullet points here if you want to save in words of characters, as long as you address the key points and you use them wisely. So for this criteria, what's being asked is around your financial viability, your reporting, your governance, your risk management, and your experience. And the funder is really asking, can your organisation deliver what you say you're going to deliver? And what you need to be providing in this response is about information about your organisation, your track record, your staff experience in dealing with the identified cohort, understanding of cohort's barriers to employment, and how you're going to reach your cohort. Another really important thing to be considering. You might have a great project idea and it's really well thought out. And we have seen previously this happen in some regions where that organisation actually struggles to get participants into the program. So have you thought about where you're actually going to be reaching your cohort and how you're going to be recruiting participants? Criteria 2, servicing community and industry needs. Again, this is a screenshot from that guide available on the DESBT website. And this criteria ensures the benefit of your project and that it's something that both your community and the industry you're focusing on will support. And you can see in this criteria, the documentation you're going to require is listed here in the right-hand column. You will need letters of support from local employers or industry groups for this one. And it has some detail there about what those letters of support should look like. This is what it will look like when you're inputting your information. And you can see there's a spot there for you to be attaching your letters of support. So for this criteria, servicing community and industry needs, what's really being asked is, how does your project fit in the local community? What's the community benefit? What's the community need? What's the link between your learner group or your chosen cohort and the skill shortage or labour needs? So in your response, you need to be addressing who needs work, what industry suits them, what are the labour shortages in your community, what links do you have to local employers, how will the project link with other local initiatives? Now, if your organisation is based outside of the delivery area, you will need to address community and industry links in the delivery location. So some organisations do deliver Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs across the state in more than one community. There's a couple of things to consider here. Firstly, you need to ensure that you can evidence that you understand the community that you're looking to deliver in. And the other point to make here is that when you're submitting your application, you make sure you attach the right letters of support for the community application that you're currently submitting. Sometimes that does happen where the person submitting the documentation accidentally attaches the wrong region's letter of support and then it doesn't match. So make sure you're on top of those details. Criteria 3, so strategies to assist participants. Essentially, Skilling Queenslanders for Work is an initiative targeting those who've had some barriers to gaining employment. For whatever reason, they're not employed, they're either underemployed or not in the workforce at all. And there's obviously reasons for that. So this program is about addressing those barriers. There also may be many reasons that people have been disengaged from learning environments. So this criteria shows that you understand the barriers specific to the group that you're targeting and that you have plans for how you're going to support those participants. Think about organisations or services in your community and who could assist you to support participants and whether or not you need to find out more about their specific challenges. Things you might be thinking about here are things like language, childcare, transport, cultural safety. There are lots of things to think about here. This is what it will look like when you're inputting your information. And note that here that you need to provide a template of a training and support plan. That's your organisation's plan, not what the RTO will deliver. So RTOs generally will have a training or learning plan for participants. This is not what you're attaching here is not that. This is your plan for how you will be supporting participants. And this really highlights the benefit of going through the application early, so you can put this on your checklist and make sure you have it ready to attach to your submission. So what's being asked here in criteria 3 for strategies to assist participants is really, how are you going to support participants to overcome barriers? Support might include lots of things, providing career advice, job preparation, communication skills, mentoring, mental health support, individual case management. What you really need to address here is that you show that you understand how the people will need to interact with different support services and that you've made those connections already. So a particular Skilling Queenslanders for Work tip is find appropriate training strategies. So here are some of the things that you really need to be considering and thinking about when you're putting together your funding application. Now, I really recommend jumping on the DESBT website and having a look at the current projects being delivered. And in the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar, there are quite a few examples shared of successful Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects. And in those examples, they actually talk about what supports they offered participants, which is, it's really great to get some ideas from them. So some of the things you might need to think about are subsidised meals. You might be partnering with someone to do that. You might need to utilise subsidised travel or partner with an organisation that has a minibus that might be able to transport participants. There's all kinds of things that you can do with Skilling Queenslanders for work funding. These are just some of the things to think about. Now, criteria 4 is outcomes. In this section of the application, they're establishing their confidence in the value of funding your project. So what will be the outcomes of it? Outcomes will vary according to the specific program you're applying for. They're not all the same. So the department's expectations about the outcomes will be achieved for each program. Their expectations of what will be achieved, are published on their website in the program guidelines. I'll show you what that looks like right now. So here are the program guidelines for one of the 8 programs in this funding round, and we'll share that in the chat. So it's called Community Work Skills. And if we look at the expected outcome section, we can see here where I've circled that the completion outcome should be 65% of participants gaining the qualification, and the employment outcome is 55% of participants. So this helps us be really clear about what DESBIT's actually expecting from each of their programs. And it means you can think realistically about the goals you're setting for the project idea you're putting together. Can you meet this standard? If you think that it would be difficult, you might need to tweak your program idea so you have a better chance of meeting these expected outcomes. So what's being asked here in this criteria? Really, you're asking, how are you going to help your participants get a job? What you need to address is qualification matching the skill shortage or labour market need, the cohort, and the strategies to overcome the barriers in place. Employers know your organisation, they support your project, and if possible, they would employ your participants. And here you can refer to past outcomes. It's a great way to establish confidence in your ability to meet expectations. Now, here's a key tip from one of those jobs committee members that I referred to earlier. When we spoke to them, they said that it was important that applicants talk about their connections to the community and to their local employers. Okay, now the final criteria, it's the money, cost and value. What will it cost and what's going to be provided in kind? Now, that's a really important question. Many organisations are providing quite a bit in kind. And so DESBIT's able to look at that budget and see that they're getting quite good value for money in funding this organisation to deliver a program, because the organisation and their connections, those they're partnering with, are able to provide a lot of value add to the money that they're funding. Will it be cost effective? Now, cost and value is not just about price. So DESBIT does have nominal benchmarks for costs, but best value does not always mean the cheapest. Obviously, you do need to address how you came up with the costs, and you need to justify how those costs will help participants overcome barriers and get a job. So we need to be really realistic with our budgets, but it doesn't have to be the cheapest necessarily. Good support might cost, but if you can show that it's really going to get the outcome sought, that might be well worth the fund they're investing in. It's really important to outline how much in-kind contribution is being included and what it entails. And remember to think about what your organisation is providing and articulate that in your budget. So examples for that may include things like you might have a meeting room or a training room, and you might be actually using that to deliver the training in. You might be providing catering. You might have your own minibus as an organisation, and you be using that to transport participants to and from training or places of work. So they're all the kinds of things to consider when you're thinking about what value add your organisation is giving to this program. So these tips really apply to all your tender writing projects. Be realistic when setting your budget. You want to be competitive, but you also want to ensure that you've thought about all the costs delivering the project and you're not being caught out short, at the end when you're acquitting all of your budget, that you haven't actually cut yourself short of funding. If your costs are on the higher side, make sure you explain why in your application. Like I said, it's not always about being the cheapest. If you have one, your budget is a little higher than most, but you've got you've articulated really well why that is in your budget, that might not actually be a problem. For example, if you're in a remote area, transport costs are obviously going to be higher there. Ensure, again, that you include all your in-kind support, whether or not it's financial or otherwise. Make sure that you read the guidelines to see what costs are allowed in the funding, and think about how you're going to acquit your grant and how you're going to demonstrate the amount of time and effort you budgeted for in kind has actually been contributed. Now, there's some more information here on a website that I recommend checking out for some tips around budgeting for tenders. Now, here's 5 top budgeting tips for Skilling Queenslanders for work. And we actually have these tips contained in a short video that you can find on our website and on the Desbet website. So eligible and ineligible costs. Make sure your costs are eligible. This is a really common mistake, but it's one that's easy to avoid. So the guide for applying for funding, which is on the Desbet website and the one that we have shared today, makes this really clear. For example, you cannot include office furniture or motor vehicles, but you can include support costs such as subsidised travel or meal programs for participants. So the department has identified some confusion from SKU providers regarding funding for post-participation support. So to be really clear on this point, Skilling Queenslanders for Work funds are only able to be expended on eligible activities until the delivery end date, despite your final report for the project not being due for another 90 days. So the support you choose to offer participants in that period is in-kind support. Okay, that's not that support is not something that SKU funding is available for. So just being really clear about that. Number 2, including staffing costs. So make sure your wage expenses actually include everything involved in wage expenses, such as superannuation and award increases, and include those details like the award rate in your budget too. So if your budget needs to include work cover costs, check your insurance policy to ensure you're budgeting the right amount for each trainee. If you're submitting an application for a work skills traineeships and you need to claim for work cover expenses, there is an accurate figure that you'll be able to calculate by checking your insurance policy. And assessors do know what kind of a normal average bracket of percentages is for claiming for work cover. So if it's outside of that normal bracket, firstly, it won't look very professional because it will look like you've probably just guessed it. And it might start to make your assessor feel uneasy or uncertain about the other costs that you've included. Because if you've guessed that figure, what else is not quite right in the rest of the budget? So number 3, spending locally. Is there someone you could be partnering with locally to cut down on travel costs? So those assessing applications look favourably on submissions which utilise local partnerships. It is sometimes easier to have partnerships with big organisations or businesses that approach you because they might have the infrastructure to do so fairly easily. It might be a well-known name, so you feel like you can trust them in the process a little bit more. But it really is, this initiative really is looking to grow local partnerships and support participants long-term in their communities. So not only do you cut on travel costs by using local suppliers and trainings, but you contribute to that long-term goal of forming community-based partnerships. Also, a technical aspect of this is that some travel is actually ineligible for funding, such as interstate travel. So again, check those funding guidelines. Number 4, include detail. So detailed budgets mean you won't get caught out claiming for something that's not an eligible expense and makes it much easier for financial reconciliation. Those assessing your application will feel confident that they know exactly what it is that they're funding, which is a really big positive for you. Detailed budgets also make things like acquittals easier. If you have any unexpected or expected staff turnover during the SKU project, so much easier for a new person to come in and take over a program and a budget if the budget's really clear. It takes all the guesswork out of what they should be spending money on. And lastly, make sure it adds up. So we recommend getting your your writing checked by someone who's not in your tender team, someone to proofread your writing. And the same applies for your budget. Get someone else to run through the numbers and make sure everything adds up. You would be really surprised at how common it is to have budgets where the total doesn't actually add up to all the line items in the budget. So having someone double check that for you is a really good idea. So the first pitfall, which we see and one to avoid, is not addressing the assessment criteria. So the assessment criteria, obviously the key things your application is going to be assessed against, and they are the things that your funder is most interested in hearing about. So if you're not explicitly addressing each of those assessment criteria and providing evidence to back it up, the assessors can't really get a good idea about if your project is going to actually meet the objectives of their program, which is obviously their priority, and how they're going to be making decisions about which programs get funded. On a similar note, it's important to provide a clear and accurate project summary. If the assessors can't quickly glean from your project summary what your project is all about, your application is not going to stand out. The next pitfall is not demonstrating local knowledge and understanding of your cohort. This initiative is all about local communities, tailored, person-centered support. It's going to be really obvious if you don't know your community well, and that if there's not demonstrated support for your project idea throughout the community and with your local employers. Now, you might think that cutting and pasting text from a previous application will save you time, but often there is a lot more effort in editing it to make it relevant than if you had started from scratch. So absolutely reference old writing that you've done, previous applications that you've written, but try and resist the copy and paste urge. And lastly, of course, it's the budget with no detail or incorrect numbers. Okay, so step 6B, providing supporting evidence. So as you're crafting responses to the assessment criteria, you need to be thinking about what evidence you can provide to support your application. And this is where it pays to have built up your grants reference library that I mentioned right at the beginning, as there is a lot of information in there ready to go. You should also map out what other documents or the grant application requires, such as the letters of support from your local community, local council, businesses, partnership agreements, project budget, and so on. You can make sure that you've got everything together ready to go. So letters of support, they're a really crucial part of a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what those look like. So it's really important that you provide evidence from local employers that they support your project, not just that they support your organisation. You must be able to show a link between training and skills development and local employment outcomes. Make sure they're relevant to the training in your proposal, that they demonstrate industry demand for the qualifications that you've identified in your proposal, and that they link to employment opportunities in your region, and that they're current. So we're not using old letters of support, because things change quickly, don't they? Particularly in the job market at the moment, things are changing pretty rapidly. So an old letter of support just won't cut it. Now, it doesn't need to be a commitment from an employer that they're going to provide a job for your participant, although obviously that would be fantastic. But what the letters of support really are support in principle, that the skills your participants are gaining through the program you're going to deliver are in demand in your community, and that employers are likely to employ someone with those skills. So it would be, I'm going to use an example here. If I was delivering a Skilling Queenslanders for Work, I've got this great project, and I'm going to be training some baristas for the cafes in my local community, because they're all short on baristas at the moment. If I went down to the cafe down the road and said, could I have a letter of support? And they provided me with a letter that said, Stacey from QCOS is lovely to work with. QCOS is a great organisation. They always do really good work. We support what they do. That's not adequate, because it doesn't actually talk about the fact that I'm training baristas, that's a specific shortage that they've noticed in their industry. Do you see what I mean here? It needs to actually be specific to the project that you're delivering, not just supporting your organisation. And that's the distinction that's really important to make here for the letters of support. And don't forget, regarding evidence, you must include 2 years of audited financial statements, and they need to be your most recent ones. It's a common mistake of those who are resubmitting applications to use an old version of templates or things that they've done previously. Again, it's fine to refer to old work that you've done as a guide, but make sure you write things out fresh. And as with any project, it's really important to be clear about your financial obligations. This is the kind of detail that might be overwhelming to start with, but getting clear about what's required is much easier at the outset than at the end, when you might be required to produce specific records. So if you're unsure, chat to your DESBIT team. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you may need to have a separate bank account. Some of you may have an accounting or finance system that is sophisticated enough to extract transactions specific to the project, but if not, you really need to consider the need for a separate bank account. And obviously, this is the kind of thing that's much easier done right at the beginning before you actually hit the ground, because it's not easy to backtrack with financial matters. And the last step in this stage of the last stage of this methodology is really nailing it. So by the time we finish writing an application, we're close to the deadline, and often there's not a lot of time left for finessing. But it's a really important step, and it can be the difference that makes your application stand out. So make sure you do allocate some time. Try and actually have the application itself finished before the due date, so that you have some time on the day or before, if possible, to edit, proofread, and check that you've got that the attachments that you're going to upload are all the correct ones. And once you finish your application, you can breathe out and reflect and ask for feedback. So I'm going to go into some of the writing skills here that will assist you with the actual writing aspect of it, the proofreading part. Okay, so your response needs to be clearly written. And when I say this, I mean you're using simple and direct language. We're using a predominantly active voice. We're not using unnecessarily big, fancy words. We're not using lots of jargon that would confuse the assessor or the funder. Remember, they might not actually have ever worked in the sector that you work in before. So thinking carefully about who's actually reading this funding application and whether or not it's going to make sense to them. So keep the language simple. We don't need anything big and fancy. We don't need cliches, jargon, or euphemisms. And imagine you're explaining the program to a family member or a friend who doesn't work in the same sector as you. Would they be able to understand easily what the project is about? Lose adverbs and words that don't add value, such as really, basically, and actually. This is especially important if there's a word count and you're limited, which is the case for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. We are limited. Now, there is some evidence to say, which is quite interesting, I think, that people are more likely to believe what you're writing if it's simple to understand. In fact, anything that makes a statement easier to mentally process, and you're submitting this in an online portal, so this isn't as relevant to this particular context, but there is evidence to say that even things like using a cleaner font or writing things neatly can actually alter the reader's perception of the truth of the statement. It's called the illusion of truth effect. And I just think it's an interesting thing to mention here. Keeping things simple definitely has benefit. Okay, so we've had make it clear. Now we've got make it concise. So less is more, but make sure it's enough. So it's about using your best examples and evidence to support your point, not using all of your evidence and examples. Being concise and clear goes hand in hand. You can use acronyms and abbreviations, but use them wisely so that they don't obstruct the clarity of the message that you're putting forward. And again, don't assume that the reader knows what they mean. It can be helpful when referring to long titles or program names to use them once and then put in brackets their acronym or their shortened name, and then use the shorter version for the rest of the document. And that's fine. The opposite to being concise is failing to get to the point. And you see this often in responses that include lots of detail and examples, but don't make explicit connections between them and don't seem to have a clear purpose. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they're bad points. It just means you haven't done the work to establish their relevance. And if this is the case, sometimes it's that there's far more examples than's required. Occasionally, this is compensating for the fact that the examples aren't really hitting the nail on the head. They're not quite working for the key message you're trying to make. When you fail to get to the point, you're asking the reader to do all the work to construct meaning from your text. It's a principle of good writing, and particularly for tender writing, to make the reader do as little work as possible. You're trying to make everything very clear for them because they can see direct links between what they've asked you in the assessment criteria and what's written in front of them. Everything should be geared to making things as easy as possible to read and clear as possible. Make it comprehensive. So your answer needs to be comprehensive. You can't just cherry pick the bits that you feel comfortable with. So when I'm talking about comprehensive, I don't mean that there's just a lot of words there, but that your words are balanced and you're adequately responding to every aspect of the selection criteria or the assessment criteria. So remember that your answer is being scored on each criteria, and likely that they're scoring sub-components of each criteria too. So for example, if you've been asked to describe your project, explain the evidence base that underpins it, and talk about how it will achieve the outcomes, that's 3 things, it's likely that the panel will have a scoring matrix allocating about 33% to each of those components. So if you only focus on 1 or 2 of those and only leave one sentence to address the last thing, you are really limiting your possible score here for this response. So that scaffolding structure that I mentioned earlier in the methodology, where we allocate a word count to each key message and what piece of evidence we're going to use for that, really helps us to avoid writing an unbalanced response. And avoid making unsubstantiated claims and failing to provide evidence or examples. Sometimes we see organisations making generalised claims, such as XYZ organisation is an industry leader in the field. But if you say that, the onus is on you to provide evidence. So make sure you're not making these vague claims. And again, using that previous evaluation data is a great way to provide evidence in your response. And make it persuasive. So your answer should persuade the reader to believe your claims. Other than being simple and clear, the best way to do this is by providing good examples and evidence. It can also help us to use the same type of language or buzzwords as the funder. So you're noticing that there's a particular phrase or some words that the funder mentions a lot in the documents that support the funding application. You might like to reflect that in your own writing. Now, when I say make it persuasive, I'm obviously not meaning that we're persuading anyone of anything that's not true. But the fact is that when we have good examples and evidence for the things that we're saying, it makes it really easy for that assessor to believe what we're saying and gives them a lot of confidence in the rest of our writing. Now, your answer could be everything we've just talked about, but if your points are not relevant to the tender opportunity, it won't help. So keep it on point. Make sure it is relevant. Make sure your points link to the requirements of the particular tender or grant, and focus on the benefits you're offering to the funder in order to maximize the relevance. You rarely need words like perhaps, maybe, try, attempt, possible. They tend to creep in when we're not sure and we're not confident to make a strong statement. As well as adding words, your lack of confidence is likely to be picked up by the reader. So make sure you think about what message you're really trying to send here. You can see here in the example on the screen, we've got exactly the same message in both of these sentences. So the reader gains exactly the same key message, but there's a huge variation in the amount of words that have been used to make the point. So first we have, perhaps you could try to reduce word count by looking to see if it's possible maybe to attempt to remove indecision. Okay, so we got a message from that sentence, but we get exactly the same from this sentence. You could reduce words by removing indecision. Far less words to say exactly the same thing. And this is why editors and proofreaders are such an asset to the tender writing process because they can really help us pick up on those things. For any Star Wars fans on the line, you can remember clear, concise, comprehensive, persuasive, and on point by thinking about our friend here, C-3PO. Now, a fresh set of eyes will always pick up new things that you might not have noticed. When you've written something, it can be really difficult to pick up on mistakes or unclear messages. And that's because your head's been in the game while you've been writing this tender, so you know what it is that you're talking about, and it's not as easy for you to then identify when something's not clear. So getting someone else to have a read through is really beneficial, and it's more beneficial if they haven't actually been involved in the tender writing process or they're not familiar with the project, because they will be able to give you that outside perspective and tell you whether or not your project idea is clear to a reader who hasn't had previous exposure to the idea, which will be exactly the case for your assessor reading through your application. Now, the Hemingway app is one example of a program that you can use to copy and paste your content in and get immediate feedback. So editing tools like this can really help you evaluate your text, and you can learn from them and get better at your writing by getting that constant feedback. They're a really great tool to use, especially if you are in a smaller organization. You might not have someone on hand to be proofreading your work, but I do strongly recommend that you get another human to independently review your application, and preferably, again, someone who hasn't worked on the submission. Now, before you submit that application, triple checking your attachments. There's no going back once you hit that submit button. So it's really important that you've got all of the most up-to-date documents that you're attaching in the portal. And breathe. Ask for feedback. If you haven't been successful previously in submitting an application for Skilling Queenslanders for work, I really hope that you've asked for some feedback so that you can refine your submission this time around. And look, as I have mentioned, the good news is that Skilling Queenslanders for work is here to stay. So there's an opportunity to refine your ideas and apply for funding again if you're not successful. And I do recommend getting in touch with your local regional DESBT office because they're very happy to chat to you about that. Now, I've also included here a link on questions to ask when reading the conditions of your funding agreement. So while receiving a grant is fantastic news, very exciting for any organisation that's successful in receiving a tender, it's really important to check the conditions attached before you accept it. So I do recommend reading through your service agreement or contract thoroughly before you sign on the dotted line. And you can clarify any questions that you might have with your funder beforehand. Okay, now that was a movie length edition of writing tender applications. Are there any questions about the writing before I get into the Human Rights Act and the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations? Really happy to hear any feedback, comments or questions before we move on. Okay, the chat's quiet, so I'm going to take that as everything was comprehensive enough and you don't have any questions at the moment. But if you do think of any, pop them in the chat. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. We're going to move into the Queensland Human Rights Act and the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations. Michael's just shared the link to the Queensland Human Rights Commission, where you can find out lots of information about the Queensland Human Rights Act. Now, if you're successful in obtaining a grant, congratulations firstly, and these are two documents that you need to be aware of and understand the implications for your project. Even if you don't obtain SKU funding, it's a really good idea to be across them anyway. Now, the Queensland Human Rights Act commenced on the 1st of January 2020, and it lists 23 human rights. Modern human rights law has evolved since the late 1940s, initially in response to the atrocities of World War II, where the world said, we can't see these things happen again. People have human rights and we need to protect them. Australia has signed most of the existing international human rights treaties, but it's really only when these rights are incorporated into domestic legislation that they become properly protected. Queensland was the third state or territory to introduce human rights legislation in Australia. So the first was the ACT in 2004, and then Victoria followed suit in 2006. The Human Rights Act applies to public entities in Queensland. So a public entity is an organisation or body performing a public function in and for Queensland. There are two types of public entities. So public entities are government entities, and they include government agencies and departments like DESBIT, the Queensland Police Service, hospitals, public schools, local government, those kinds of public entities. And then there's functional public entities, and they are entities that are considered public entities when they're performing a function of public nature on behalf of the state. So organisations funded by government to provide public services fall under this category. So that's community organisations when we're delivering services on behalf of the Queensland government. At these times, in this context, the community sector is viewed as an extension of government, and that's why the Human Rights Act applies to the work that we're doing. Now, if you think about the perspective of the participants you're supporting through these programs with multiple and complex needs, there are many systems they move within and agencies that they interact with who make decisions on their behalf that affect them and their livelihoods and their welfare all of the time. So it's really important that we're aware of the Human Rights Act and how it might affect our work. The Human Rights Act identifies 23 specific human rights that are to be protected. There are a range of human rights over time. It helps to become familiar with them over time. So rights that you might see as more applicable to the work you're doing might include Section 17, protection from torture or inhumane or degrading treatment, privacy and reputation, cultural rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and right to education. It's important to note that people have rights, not organisations. And whether or not you have citizenship, you are still entitled to human rights protection in Queensland. There is plenty of information on the Queensland Human Rights Commission website if you're interested in finding out more about the Human Rights Act, including some professional development workshops that you can do online. Okay, so national principles for child-safe organisations. So many of you will be familiar with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. And that Royal Commission uncovered some really shocking abuse of children within institutions in Australia. And the Commission recommended taking action to make sure organisations across the country are safe for children. The development of the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations is a key national reform in response to those recommendations. The principles have been endorsed by the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments. They provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding child-safe cultures within organisations that engage with children and act as a vehicle to give effect to the Royal Commission recommendations related to child-safe standards. So these are really underpinned by child rights approaches and based on the standards recommended by the Royal Commission. And they're really designed to build capacity and deliver child safety and wellbeing in organisations, in families and communities, and prevent future harm. In order to allow flexibility in the implementation and recognition of the variety of organisational types, sizes, and capacity. And here are the national principles. There's 10 of them. You can find them on the Human Rights website. And it will be in the post-event email. Now, things to keep in mind with these principles is that you may be delivering a program to a child, particularly if you've got youth as your target cohort, or some of your supporting services around a participant might include their child or family. So some organisations might be providing kind of a childcare facility or something like that. So really important for you to consider ensuring that your organisation is a child-safe organisation. Now, that was a very quick run through of the Human Rights Act and Child Safe Organisations, so happy to discuss further if you've got any questions. But that is the end of the content that I've got. So it's open for comment and question. Michael is going to put a poll up on your screen now where you can give us feedback about how you found this workshop, but I will stay on the line for a few minutes if you've got anything that you would like to discuss. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Good luck with all of your tender writing. I hope to see some of your organisation names up on the DESBT website when they do the announcement of successful programs.
On behalf of the NQ region, I'd like to say thank you, Stacey, and the QCOS team for delivering this workshop. It was really informative, even from where we sit from an assessment perspective. We can understand and or it was a good explanation, I should add, of how to contextualize the application and to meet that assessment criteria. So it was really helpful. Regionally, we are delivering an additional, what we call a Q&A session next Thursday, the 24th of February, between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. So this session is really about giving the attendees examples of regional work programs that have been successful and what they've included in their budget. So that might be an option. Wonderful. But we definitely encourage people to reach out to our office. We're happy to review budgets and provide any feedback prior to organisations submitting their application. But thank you, Stacey. It was really informative, but I'm hanging around to answer questions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yes, context is so important when we're looking at tender applications. So I'm thrilled to get that feedback from you, that it was helpful from your standpoint as well. And you have reminded me that on the 21st of March, we have a tips and tricks webinar. It's a 1 hour, pretty succinct workshop or webinar, I should say, where organisations who are nearly ready to submit, it's 10 days before the due date, so the 21st of March, can come along to that webinar just to get a quick reminder of the tips and tricks for putting together a good application before they hit that submit button. So if you are new to tender writing or new to Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you might want to come along to that 1 hour webinar just to brush up on everything before you hit submit. Thank you. I'm just checking the chat. There's some comments in there. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's nearly the weekend. We're nearly there. So I recommend grabbing that Grant on a Page resource, jotting down any ideas that you might have had, any brainwaves you might have had during the workshop. And when you get back to your desk on Monday, you'll be ready to start building on that. Doesn't look like we do have any questions, but if you think of anything after this session's finished, definitely get in touch with your regional office. All right. I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.